everyone. Welcome to another live video with the Egyptologist in the closet office. Today I want to talk about a third rail kind of topic. So let's see what comes up. But let's see who's here. Hey Ra, how you doing? Who else is watching? Hi Thomas. Hey Michelle. Steven, hi Steven, how you doing? Hi Tamara, San Diego, Portland, hi Jacob. Hi Tim. Hi Megan from Connecticut. Hi Pasquale. Haley, how you doing? Haley, I like that. Hi from Hungary, Pal. Hi Amberly. Bangladesh, wow. Extraordinary. So, hello Ron, hello Patrick, and now I'm gonna look away, because if I keep looking at the comments, I can't focus, because I'm about to touch a third rail, and let's see how that goes. So I want to talk about what everyone's been discussing right now, which is racism and quiet, insidious, unseen racism, and racism where we all live and work. And you guys know I'm an Egyptologist. So it means I study people of Africa, and I am not of African descent myself, except, don't forget, we got that genetic test with the 5%, so woohoo! Though I did not know it until a year ago. And I want to talk about racism within Egyptology. And I have talked about this in this Facebook, YouTube context before. And I have done so on my own, and I've done so with Dr. Jonathan Winterman of UCLA. And we think about these things a lot. We talk about it a lot. Jonathan comes from the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. That's where he was trained. I was trained at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, known as the Institute of Albright, and an ancient Near Eastern powerhouse. And just these names, the ancient Near East, the Oriental Institute, just these names smack of racism within our line of work, our academy, the way we do things, and this racism within Egyptology. So, you know, if I'm asking, is Egyptology racist? This is the discussion that we all have to have about what racism is. That's not saying that Egyptology X is racist or Egyptology Y is racist, though I have to say I have seen it. And there are Egyptologists who dress up in jodhpurs and pith helmets and colonial garb and go out into Egypt with absolutely no self-referentiality of what that does to Egyptians who see them in their colonial get-ups. Those are Egyptologists from Yale, and you can do some Google searching. So there is racism within Egyptology, within individuals, but most of it is racism within accounting, racism within law enforcement, racism within the government. It is racism that is systemic, that is part of an institution, that is something that individuals aren't necessarily responsible for. But if we don't, as individuals, speak up and notice it and say something, then there are issues. And so it is time for Egyptology as a discipline and as a science to speak up and say, why do we use words like Oriental? Why do we use words like the Near East? Near East implies that it is near to something, but it is east of it, and it implies that it is near to the West. It is near to Greece and the European Mediterranean. So that's what the ancient Near East means. It is east in relation to the center of the world, right? So ancient Near East or Middle East, these are in and of themselves problematic terms. So do you call yourself the Department of African Studies, African and West Asian Studies? Maybe. Maybe just taking a strict geographic perspective would be the best way to do it, but we should at least talk about what terms like Oriental or Ancient Near East do to people, and how it makes people feel, and how it excludes certain people from a discipline. So when I ask, is Egyptology racist, I'm not saying, oh yeah, look at all these people whom I know are racist. We are all culpable. We are all part of this system, and we all have to be talking about it. We all have to be discussing what it means. So, and you know, I'm open to anything that people have to say. If you disagree, if you think I've missed something, get in there, because I am the entitled white chick talking about this, and you know, I I am the beneficiary of these systems, and it is thus hard for me to see the exclusionary nature of how it actually works. So do jump in. But Egyptology in and of itself, as I think you guys know, is based on colonialism, right? And so there are two layers of racism within Egyptology. Number one, there's the colonial element of the white European man or American man or Australian man going into Egypt, taking stuff, taking treasures as early as the 18th century, bringing them back to museums in these places and studying these things, being the great savant, and then telling the lowly Egyptians they don't understand what they have. They don't, you know, there's a book written by Brian Fagan that I could find if I looked for. Let's see. I think I've got it. Here's a good one. The Rape of the Nile by Brian Fagan, University of California, San Diego professor. So, you know, how do these colonials go in, take over Egypt in terms of the study of its antiquity, claim it, such that if you're working in Egypt today as an Egyptian archaeologist or an Egyptian historian of ancient Egyptian data sets, then you will be more successful if you get your PhD in Europe, Germany, Britain, France, or in the United States. And then you come back to Egypt with that PhD. That is the colonial means to success. And that's something that we have to discuss. That Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered by Howard Carter, a British Egyptologist, under the control of a patron, Lord Carnarvon, a British patrician who funded that. And while there was discussion amongst Egyptologists with this great find about whether or not it should be divided, as so many finds had been up to that point, the discoverer gets to take some back to the Met, and the rest stays in the Cairo Museum, for example. With the magnitude of the find of Tutankhamun, it was decided to keep all of those objects within Egypt, but don't forget that it was the French Antiquities Service that made that decision. So all of it was colonially done. All of it was colonially controlled. And even with the revolution in Egypt in 1950 that removed British/French European colonial control from its antiquities system, it is still under the yoke of having to learn French and German rather than Arabic. Having to learn, I learned 3 languages to be able to do Egyptology: French, German, and Italian. I can't speak them all. I can speak German, and my French is horrific, but I can read them all, and I can read a bit of Dutch. And this is what I have to be. I can't read Arabic to save my life. I can speak a little Egyptian Arabic, but you can see the inherent colonialism in that very fact of what I needed to learn to become an Egyptologist, and what Egyptians still need to learn to become Egyptian Egyptologists. The colonial weight is quite heavy. I'm working with a co-PI. This is for those of you who don't know, this is academic jargon when you write a grant. If the grant is yours, you are the PI, you're the principal investigator, and it's yours. If you write the grant with somebody else, then that person is your co-PI, co-principal investigator. And I'm working with a co-PI right now who is working on his dissertation in Germany. And he knows that this is the better place for him to get his dissertation. It's better funded. He'll be able to do it in a shorter amount of time. And that dissertation from Germany will be worth more than the dissertation from Egypt. The colonialism, the unfairness of that, the systemic racism of that is quite visible, I think. So that's something that needs to be called out. So that's the colonialism. That one could write all kinds of books about that. And that's just a very short touch on the topic. Now, I'm an American Egyptologist, and that means that I'm working in a country based on the economics of slavery, the unequal treatment of people of color versus white people, and all of the racism that that entails within the United States. So there's also an exclusion of African Americans within my field of Egyptology. There is not one African American Egyptologist in the academy whom I know of within Egyptology, within traditional Egyptology, in the Oriental Institutes of the world, or in the Near Eastern languages and cultures departments of the world. Not one. And the field is extraordinarily divided. It is cut in two, and there is great distrust for obvious reasons, because the Egyptians have been claimed as white. They have been, in a sense, whitewashed. They have been, let me put it this way. I was co-curator for the Tutankhamun exhibition in 2005 at the LA County Museum of Art. And National Geographic released a reconstruction of Tutankhamun that it put in one of the exhibition rooms in that space in the museum. And you can look it up, and it shows Tutankhamun rather like Barbra Streisand, and with skin about this color, my skin right now on this camera. I would like all of you who are like, yeah, but of course Tutankhamun had lighter skin and I've seen it. Well, Google two things for me. One, Google people of Luxor, because Tutankhamun comes from a Theban family and he's from Thebes. Go look at modern day Luxor, which are people of Thebes, and see what skin color they have, what they look like. As I've always said, if you took an ancient Egyptian and put him or her into Alabama in 1954, they would have had to sit at the back of the bus. So if you're asking, were the ancient Egyptians black? My answer is yes. Where else was I going with that? The second thing, right. So then also Google Tutankhamun head lotus blossom, and you will see the skin color that Tutankhamun wanted to be represented with. Also Google Tutankhamun mannequin, mannequin like a mannequin that's wearing clothes. And there's this strange statue with arms cut off that's only a torso, but it gives you the skin color that is more naturalistic, that Tutankhamun may actually have had. And it is certainly much darker than this lily white skin color that you see before you. When this Tutankhamun reconstruction was put up in the LACMA, LA County Museum of Art exhibition, there was a great outcry from the African American community in Los Angeles and throughout the United States, because Tut was being claimed, King Tut was being claimed as white. He was taken by the white people. And we can't even have this, he's African, and we can't even have King Tut. So there was picketing outside of the museum, and people were marching up and down the museum saying King Tut is back and he's black. And I remember colleagues laughing about it and saying, oh, rolling their eyes, and oh, here we go again. And I remember thinking, but why are we claiming Tut as white? And why are other people then not allowed to claim him as black? And what is this argument that we're actually having? Because Egyptology within the United States not only has to deal with the colonialism and the anti-Egyptian isms of the work happening within Egypt, going all the way back to the 18th century and arguably beyond. But then you add the African American component into it, and it becomes much more complicated. And you know that I am interested in complicated and messy things. So when I saw people picketing, I'm like, well, this is interesting. There are all these claims going on, and some people get very upset by this. And it reminded me of a scholarship that I got once at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And I applied as an Egyptologist for a non-Western position. And I remember they wrote me back and said, well, you've applied for a non-Western, but we think Egypt is Western, so we are asking you to apply for the Western fellowship. And so I changed it and I applied from, I don't remember what the non-Western one was called, but I got the Crest Fellowship in the end. And the Crest Fellowship funded Western archaeological and art historical examinations. And I got the fellowship. So I was at the National Gallery of Art for 2 years, and that's great. But how interesting that there are these categorizations that even the National Gallery of Art was claiming Egypt as Western, that you can't have that origin of human civilization be black or be of color. And I don't think the people who are making this decision are individually or were individually racist. I think the people making this decision were working within a system in which these great antiquities can be claimed and can be taken by the Western white system, and that it was easier to see Egypt as a precursor to Greece and thus claim the African civilization of Egypt than it is to say that the African civilization of Egypt is African and then let that have influenced the whiter civilization of Greece. These are complicated things, right? But I've seen this categorization work against people of color. And when I say that Egyptology is divided, let me explain to you in the United States exactly what I mean. There's traditional Egyptology studies that happen in these Oriental institutes or ancient Near Eastern departments. And then there is African American or Afrocentrism, in which African Americans or people of Africa feel they can study ancient Egypt on their terms without all of the overlay of colonialism or in direct opposition to the overlay of colonialism. So there is a political opposition within the field of Afrocentrism. So if you're going to study ancient Egypt as a person of color, as you start out on that journey, and say you're at a university where you can choose to do Egyptology either in a classics department, or you can do Egyptology in an AFAM, African American Studies Department, or African Studies Department, politically, you're going to feel more connected to the study that supports your people as something you can claim as your own. And so a person of color is going to repeatedly, again and again, make the decision not to go with the white man's game of Egyptology in an Oriental Institute or Near Eastern Studies department, but instead go towards the African studies and Afrocentrism. And thus we have in this country a divide between Egyptologists who work in the traditional white departments that have more money, that have more endowments, that have more support, and thus get more attention, or in the Afrocentrist departments, often at historically black universities like Howard in Washington, D.C. And indeed, at Howard in Washington, D.C., there's Egyptology in two places, one in the African American Studies department and one in the Classics department. And they kind of overlap each other, but the two have not been brought together. And there's, that right there is a very interesting thing to see. And I've learned about this, that I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, that out of all of the historically black universities in the United States, Howard in Washington, D.C., I think is the only one that has a classics department. Classics, which is in a sense the study of white people ruling the world. It's the study of Greece and Rome being the origins of everything that is historically laudable, politically copyable, emulable, the classics being what it is we're supposed to study, the great books, the great Western civilization. That is what classics departments have been. And that is why classics departments all around the United States are looking at what they are as a kind of white studies, white European studies, and they're having to rethink what that actually means. So, Egyptology used to be very much a white man's game. And when I was getting into Egyptology, I started studying in the 90s. I started in 1994. It was still a white man's game, and most of the professors were white men throughout the United States. It has now changed to a white woman's game, but it's still systemically problematic in its exclusion of the African American within the United States. And as I tell my students at UCLA every day, Egyptology is dead. I say this in almost every seminar. I'm like, Egyptology is dead. And they're like, we know. But what does that mean? It's kind of like saying defund the police. You don't want to abolish the police. You don't want to get rid of it entirely, but you do need to dismantle it and start again. The system as it is, the institutions as they are not working for diversity and inclusion. They're working for exclusion. They're working to sell a certain kind of story. And they need to be dismantled and begun again. Things need to be renamed. Things need to be reconnected. I sit if I'm the privileged white person who studied Egyptology, I'm also rather privileged in that I am not at a typical, I'm in a Near Eastern Languages and Cultures department, to be sure, and I'm chair of one at UCLA, but I'm not at an Egyptological powerhouse. And out in Los Angeles, I'm kind of off on the fringes of Egyptology land. The Egyptology powerhouses are Chicago, Hopkins, Penn, NYU, Yale. These are the places, Princeton now, Harvard now, have added themselves to those ranks. These are the places where Egyptology is the strongest. I mean, you can feel the elitism in that list that I just gave you. And so places like UCLA or Berkeley, we're kind of out on the fringes of this game. And as such, on the fringes, we can look at it with a more jaundiced eye and also throw up our hands and say, okay, I want to do something different. I think that we should train our students in a different way. We should be more holistic. We should be crossing boundaries. We shouldn't just have the blinders on and do the Egyptology as we always have. And so if I tell my students Egyptology is dead, I know that other colleagues and scholars, Egyptology is very often the laughingstock of archaeological and historical discourse because we don't engage in discourse with colleagues from other places. We don't often engage with theory and theoretical connections. We very much play our own game in our own world, and we're not a part of the larger humanistic discourse as much as we should be and could be. And that needs to change. So Egyptological boundaries as they are need to break down. Even the word Egyptological is charged, and even the word Egypt is charged. And I can't tell you how many times I'll type the word Egypt and people are like, what are you doing calling it Egypt? That is the Greek name for this place. And it is a corrupted, weird Greek name that we don't even know where it comes from. Its etymology is more complicated than you could possibly imagine. Associated with the Temple of Ptah at Memphis. And Hutkaptah, it goes to Egyptos, and that is Egypt as we understand it. And then you have people saying, well, you need to start calling it Kemet, which is what the Egyptians use, the Black Land. It should be chematology, and that is the word that Afrocentrists use for their discussion and containment of Egyptology as a science and as a discipline. And we need to stop laughing at stuff like that. And we need to start looking at it and understanding that Egypt as a thing has been claimed by Western Civ, whatever that is. And even the name of Egypt has been whitewashed and claimed through language. That's a powerful thing to take on board. So if Egyptology is dead, that doesn't mean that Egyptological work isn't happening, but we need to tear down a lot of these walls and rebuild it as something else. It needs to become African studies, African and West Asian studies, African and Mediterranean studies. We need to use more geographic terms for what we're talking about. And let me end with the last point. I was just in a Twitter discussion about this in which somebody was saying that I was whitewashing ancient Egyptians and claiming that they weren't black. And I'm not. But what I do want to say is that if we're going to hit this politically, and we're going to look at the politics of power straight on, then we also need to understand that the ancient Egyptians themselves were just as racist as anybody else on this planet, because human beings are such. That is what we all are. It's the same way that when I'm talking about feminist studies, that women can be just as misogynist as men, and women can keep other women in their place just as much as men can. I've seen it happen with my own eyes. I think that it's important to see the ancient Egyptians as having treated Nubia in particular as a place to exploit and enslave. That's the actual history that I would like to look at. So in the same way that when I'm writing my books about female history, when women ruled the world, The Woman Who Would Be King, all of these trade books that I do about female power, I've been told, well, this is not an uplifting book. What are you telling me? You know, you're making this a tragedy. And I say, yes, I am not here to write revisionist history to make it seem awesome for you that women once ruled and thus we've got it all together and yay us, we're done here. We can be post-misogynist and post-sexist. That's bullshit. I don't believe in that. And the real history has to be told. So I write books about women's studies from the perspective that women can harm other women, that the system still needs to change, and that when women ruled in the ancient world, they always ruled for a patriarchal system that was larger than they. And if we don't see that, we don't see that in our own current system, then we cannot transcend it. And how many of you see women working within the current political discourse who are more than willing to push down women's equality because they benefit so much from the patriarchal white system that they are a part of? In the same way, if we're going to tear down Egyptology and rebuild it as something else, we have to then not fall into the same trap of creating a revisionist history that makes people of color as great heroes who did nothing wrong. And I think if you read Ibram Kendi and Stamp from the Beginning, there is a very complicated and nuanced discourse of how one can fall into that trap. And that is not what one is looking for. But I also want to encourage you to watch out for people using that against tearing this down and rebuilding it. In the same way that somebody says, Black Lives Matter, and somebody from the other side will say, no, all lives matter. Or tear down those Confederate Jim Crow statues. Well, then tear down all statues. Well, if we say, oh, Egyptology is racist, oh, well, you know, then what about, you know, the slaves were sold by black people too, and they're just as culpable. And so there's these slings and arrows coming from either side. And then we all want to take a deep breath and say, all human beings are capable of racism. All human beings create racist systems of exclusion and power. All academic disciplines are claiming things for the people in power at the moment, and we need to look at how we do that. When we tear something like Egyptology down and rebuild it, we also need to do so without the intent of rebuilding it as something that is hero worship, perfected, or idealized to tell lies about what is actually happening, such that you can look at Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, as an African system of power that raped and pillaged like any other system of power in the Northwest, in the ancient Levant, in the Northwest in ancient Libya, in the Northeast in the ancient Levant, and in the South in ancient Nubia, and that wrought a lot of havoc down further south in Sudan, in ancient Kerma and Kush. So this is where I think we should go. I really want to hear what you guys have to say about this, and I know a lot of Egyptologists watch some of my crazy stuff, and I'm interested in what you have to say about this, as well as we're all discussing this as a nation in the United States of America, what we should be and what we should become. And it's time we start to look at some of this stuff. So I will end with that, and thank you guys for listening. Take care.